I always thought family was supposed to have your back. That no matter what, blood was thicker than water. Turns out I was dead wrong. Because when money and power are involved, blood doesn't mean a damn thing. My family owned a manufacturing business. A company my grandfather built from the ground up, turning a tiny workshop into something that provided for generations. Growing up, my older brother Nick and I were raised to take over one day. At least that's what I thought. While I spent years learning every detail, operations, logistics, payroll, Nick partied his way through college, barely scraping by with a business degree he never actually used. He saw the company as his birthright, something he was entitled to, not something he had to work for. Meanwhile, I was pulling 60-hour weeks, making sure things actually ran smoothly. Still, I believed when the time came, my parents would be fair. That my years of dedication, my actual skills, would mean something. But then one conversation changed everything. I still remember the moment I walked into the dining room, my gut already telling me something was off. My brother sat across from me, looking way too smug for comfort. My father cleared his throat and said, "We've decided that Nick will take over the company when we retire." I blinked. For a second I thought I misheard him. What? My mom reached across the table, giving me this fake sympathetic smile, like I was some clueless child. "Sweetheart, you'll still be involved, of course. But as your brother's support." Support? I had worked my ass off for years, and they expected me to just stand behind Nick, cleaning up his messes while he got to run the company into the ground. Before I could even react, Nick leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Come on, sis, it's not personal. I'm the eldest son. I'll be the face of the company, you can handle the little details. You know, the stuff women are good at." I saw red. I looked at my dad, waiting for him to correct him. To say something, anything, but he just nodded. I turned to my mom. She smiled like she had just handed me some great opportunity. "You'll still have a good salary, dear. It's not like you'll be left out." I felt like I was suffocating. I pushed my chair back. "I can't believe this." "Don't be dramatic," Nick said, rolling his eyes. "It's just business. Just business." That night I cried, not because of the company but because I finally understood the truth. I was never going to be seen as equal to Nick. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would always be just the daughter. So I made a decision. I was done. The next morning I walked into my father's office and quit. He scoffed. "You're overreacting." "No," I said, voice steady. "I'm just finally seeing things clearly." And I walked out, thinking I was leaving everything behind. But then months later, we sat in a lawyer's office for the reading of my grandfather's will. My parents weren't worried. Most of his assets had been sold off years ago. They thought they were just making things official. And that's when the lawyer smiled. And everything changed. I walked into the lawyer's office, expecting nothing. I had already come to terms with my family's betrayal. My grandfather had passed away a few months earlier, and this was just a formality, some sentimental items, maybe a few donations. My parents sat across from me looking relaxed. Nick, of course, had that same smug grin he always had when he thought he was winning. The lawyer started reading through the will, listing off the usual things: small charitable donations, personal belongings gifted to close friends. My parents weren't paying much attention. They assumed everything of value had already been transferred to them. Then the lawyer said my name. "To my granddaughter, I leave something I know she will appreciate." I frowned. I hadn't expected anything. The lawyer pulled out a folder and slid it across the table to me. "This," he said, "is a separate trust. Your grandfather left you full ownership of his original workshop, the one he started the company in." Silence. I blinked, confused. The workshop? The one my grandfather used decades ago before the company expanded? I thought it had been sold or repurposed, but apparently he had kept it all these years. Before I could process it, Nick laughed. "That's it? She gets some old warehouse? Meanwhile, I'm running an actual company." He smirked at me. "Tough break, sis." The lawyer smiled. And that's when I knew Nick had screwed himself. "There's one more thing," the lawyer continued, reaching for another document. He pulled out a second set of papers and placed them in front of me. "Along with the property, your grandfather also left you all of his original patents." Nick's smirk vanished. See, our grandfather was more than just a businessman, he was an inventor. He had designed several key manufacturing processes that our company still uses to this day. Instead of selling the rights, he had only licensed them to the company. And now I own them. Nick turned to my dad, panicked. Fix this. But there was nothing to fix. My grandfather had planned this perfectly. The patents weren't just valuable, they were essential. Without them, the company couldn't operate. My dad's mouth opened and closed like a fish. My mom sat there, gripping her purse so tight her knuckles turned white. Nick was pale. And I was just getting started. Nick's face twisted, his confidence shattered in an instant. My father clenched his jaw, his brain working overtime to find a way to undo what had just happened. My mother sat frozen, gripping her purse so tightly her fingers turned white. The lawyer cleared his throat. If there are no further questions, that concludes the reading of the will. Nick snapped. This is bullshit. He turned to my dad. You can challenge this, right? Get a judge to overturn it? The lawyer gave him a polite, almost pitying smile. Your grandfather's legal team ensured everything was airtight. There is no basis for a challenge. Nick looked like he had been punched in the gut. He turned to my parents, waiting for them to fix this. But they couldn't. And then, my mother tried a different tactic. She reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on mine, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Honey, she said, why don't we be reasonable? That workshop has no real value to you. It's just an old building. Why don't you sign it over to your brother? We can arrange something fair. Fair. Like how it was fair when they handed the company to Nick without a second thought. Like how it was fair that they never considered me an equal. I looked at her hand on mine. Slowly I pulled away. No, she blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? I kept my voice steady. I said no. Nick scoffed. Jesus, don't be a brat. You don't even know what to do with patents. I smiled. Maybe. But you do. And that was the problem. Because now I was the one holding the power. I walked out of that lawyer's office with my head held high, but I knew this wasn't over. My father and Nick weren't the type to accept defeat. They were desperate. And desperate people? They make stupid mistakes. The first mistake? They thought they could buy me out. 2 weeks later, my dad called. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next day. This time I answered. Let's be practical, he started, his voice carefully neutral. Why don't we buy you out? We'll make a generous offer. How generous? He hesitated before naming a number. It was insulting. They were trying to lowball me, hoping I'd panic and take the first deal. I laughed. No thanks. And I hung up. The second mistake? Nick thought he could intimidate me. 2 days later, I heard angry knocking at my apartment door. I opened it to find Nick standing there, fuming. Are you out of your damn mind? He snapped. You're screwing over the whole company because of some petty grudge? I crossed my arms, keeping my face neutral. You mean the company you stole? From me? His jaw clenched. It wasn't yours. I tilted my head. And yet, you need my patents to keep it running. His nostrils flared. Fine. Name your price. I smiled. No. He blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean, no? I mean I'm not selling. I'm keeping them. His eyes widened. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He came here thinking I'd play along, that I'd just take a paycheck and disappear. For the first time in his life, Nick wasn't in control. And I was just getting started. Nick thought I was bluffing. He thought that if he ignored the problem long enough, I'd crack under pressure, take the money, and disappear. But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't playing his game. I was playing to win. After that heated confrontation at my apartment, I went straight to a patent attorney. I needed to understand exactly what I had, and what I had was gold. See, my grandfather had never sold his manufacturing patents. He only licensed them to my father's company. And that contract? It was set to expire in 6 months. Which meant when the deadline hit, my father's company would lose the rights to use every single patented process. And without those processes, they were dead in the water. I let that information sink in. 6 months. That was all it would take to bring down everything my family had built, everything they had handed to Nick. And I wasn't renewing a damn thing. The family starts to panic. It didn't even take 6 months for them to start falling apart. It took one. At first they ignored the problem. They thought I was just being dramatic. But then clients started asking questions. Suppliers started noticing delays. And suddenly their cozy little world wasn't so cozy anymore. Nick called me out of nowhere, his voice a little too casual. Okay, let's be adults about this, he said, trying to sound reasonable. We can negotiate. We already did, I replied. 6 months, remember? You can't be serious. Oh, but I am. Nick's fake confidence cracked. His voice got sharper, angrier. He tried everything, yelling, guilt-tripping, even playing the family card. Do you really want to destroy the business Grandpa built? I laughed. No, Nick. You did that the second you tried to screw me over. Then I hung up. But I wasn't just going to sit back and watch their company collapse. No, that would be too easy. Instead, I was going to take it for myself. While Nick and my father were busy scrambling, I was moving forward. I used my patents as leverage to take out a business loan. Then I did something that made Nick absolutely lose his mind. I reopened my grandfather's workshop. That useless old building they laughed at? Yeah, it was my new headquarters. And I didn't just restart a business. I built something better. I reached out to former employees, the ones Nick had fired or mistreated over the years. Engineers, designers, managers, people who actually knew what they were doing. People who hated my family as much as I did. The second I announced my company's launch, Nick called me. You're out of your mind, he hissed. Do you even know how to run a company? Better than you do, I shot back. Because here's the thing, I did. I had spent years doing the actual work while Nick sat in meetings pretending to be in charge. I knew the operations inside and out. I had connections. I had employees who trusted me. And most importantly, I had the patents. Which meant if any of my father's clients wanted to keep their contracts running, they had to come to me. And they did. One by one, my father's biggest clients started calling me. They had seen the mess Nick was making. They knew his ego was running the company into the ground. And now, they had a better option. Nick freaked out. He tried everything. He slashed prices, made last-minute deals, even tried to bribe employees to stay. But none of it mattered. Because at the end of the day, business is business. And Nick, he had nothing left to offer. Nick was drowning and he knew it. His entire world was falling apart right in front of him, and the worst part? There was nothing he could do to stop it. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I had top-tier employees, a fully operational facility, and most importantly, the patents. If anyone wanted to keep their supply chains moving, they had to come to me. And they did. One by one, my father's biggest clients started jumping ship. At first, it was just a few, the ones who had always hated dealing with Nick. But soon word spread. Companies saw how unstable things were becoming under his leadership, and suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The moment my company became the preferred alternative, my father's business started bleeding out. Nick wasn't going down without a fight. He slashed prices to keep contracts. He offered insane deals, anything to hold on to his remaining clients. But that only made things worse. See, when a company starts dropping their prices too fast, people start asking questions. Are they struggling? Are they desperate? Is this business even stable anymore? Nick didn't realize he was digging his own grave. Suppliers started getting nervous. Investors pulled back. Employees started jumping ship. And I watched it all happen like a front row seat to a slow-motion car crash. Then came the layoffs. They tried to keep it quiet, but people talk. Rumors started spreading. Nick's running the company into the ground. They can't afford to keep their staff. They lost another major client. Once word got out, everything collapsed. 3 months before the patents officially expired, I got another call from Nick. But this time he wasn't yelling. He wasn't trying to be smug or condescending. He was desperate. Please, he said, voice low. We'll pay whatever you want. I let the silence stretch. I wanted him to sit in it, to feel it. Then I simply said, no. And I meant it. Because this time, I was in control. By the time the 6-month deadline hit, my father's company was on life support. Investors? Gone. Clients? Gone. Employees? Gone. Nick. He had officially lost everything. But I wasn't done yet. Because Nick was about to make one last stupid mistake. Nick had lost almost everything: clients, investors, employees. His so-called leadership had driven the company straight into the ground, but instead of accepting defeat, he made one last desperate move. And as expected, it was the dumbest thing he could have done. One day I got a call from an old colleague. "You need to see this," he said, sending me a link. I clicked it and felt my stomach drop. Nick had launched a new company, one that looked suspiciously similar to mine. Same industry, same business model, and worst of all, the products he was offering were identical to the ones based on my grandfather's patents. He wasn't just trying to start over, he was trying to steal from me. Again. I hired a specialist to investigate, and sure enough, I found out exactly how he had done it. One of my trusted employees, someone I had hired from my father's failing company, had been secretly working for Nick, feeding him information. This wasn't just business, it was corporate espionage. The betrayal stung, but honestly, I was more excited than angry. Because this was an easy win. I gathered every piece of evidence: the stolen data, the confidential emails, the shady backdoor deals, and I filed a lawsuit so fast it made Nick's head spin. Patent infringement, intellectual property theft, corporate espionage. Nick tried to stall, tried to act like it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails traced back to his account. Confidential documents with his digital signature. Testimony from the employee who flipped on him the second he realized he was going down alone. It was game over. The judge didn't just rule in my favor, he destroyed Nick. Every stolen product had to be pulled from the market immediately. He was ordered to pay millions in damages. And worst of all, he was banned from operating in my industry for 10 years. His attempt at a comeback had ended before it even really started. Nick was done. The mansion? Gone. The luxury cars? Repossessed. His entire reputation? Shattered. He ended up filing for bankruptcy, drowning in lawsuits and debt he could never repay. My parents tried to guilt me, begged me to show mercy. "He's your brother," my mother sniffled. "He made mistakes." I just looked at her and said, "No, he made choices." And with that, I walked away. Because after everything they did to me, I owed them nothing. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. My company was thriving, my grandfather's legacy was stronger than ever, and Nick was finally experiencing what it felt like to fail. I had taken everything from him: his career, his status, his wealth, and I assumed he had learned his lesson. But I should have known better. People like Nick don't learn. They don't reflect. They don't take responsibility. Instead, they scheme. A few years later, I got a call from a business associate. "Hey," he said, sounding amused. "You're not gonna believe this. I just had a meeting with a guy named Nick. Says he used to run a big company, has game-changing ideas, and is looking for investors. And you'll love this. He's planning to start a business in direct competition with yours." I froze. Nick was like a cockroach. You could crush him, strip him of everything, and somehow he'd still find a way to crawl back. He was trying to revive himself, using investors who didn't know his history, spinning lies about how his vindictive sister had ruined his life and how he just needed the right backers to take back what was rightfully his. I could have ignored it, let him fail on his own. But this time, I wanted to bury him for good. I made a few calls and pulled a few strings. Then, through a third party, I became one of his investors. Not directly, of course, I wasn't stupid. But I had a business partner, an older gentleman named Mr. Holloway, who was always looking for exciting opportunities. He reached out to Nick, pretending to be interested in his new venture. And Nick? He fell for it instantly. He showed up to the meeting acting like he was still the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He presented his business proposal, filled with fake projections, exaggerated numbers, and, of course, the biggest lie of all: my sister stole everything from me. She ruined my life. All I need is the right investors to help me rebuild. Mr. Holloway played along perfectly. He nodded, acted intrigued, and then set the trap. I like what I'm hearing, he said. But before I invest, I need proof of concept. Show me what you've got. Nick panicked. He had nothing. No patents, no real products, no working prototypes. He had nothing to offer. But he couldn't admit that. His entire pitch was built on the lie that he was some business genius who just needed another chance. So, like the idiot he was, he stole again. Nick rushed to put something together, and, in his desperation, he made the worst mistake of his life. He stole one of my company's patented designs. He copied it, made a few tweaks, and rushed production to have something to present to investors. And that's when I made my move. The moment Nick unveiled his prototype, we hit him with another lawsuit. But this time, I didn't just go after him, I went after his investors, his suppliers, his entire network. The investors pulled out immediately. The suppliers cut ties. The media caught wind of it, and suddenly Nick wasn't just a failed businessman, he was a known fraud. Then, to make things even worse for him, I did something I had been planning for months. I bought out the lease to his office space. The next day, Nick showed up to work and found an eviction notice taped to the door. Everything he had left, the furniture, the computers, the last scraps of his failed empire, were locked inside a building he no longer had access to. Nick was officially finished. With no investors, no money, no reputation, and now nowhere to operate his business, he finally broke. A week later, I got an email from him. The subject line just read, "Please." I opened it. It was short. "I have nothing left. I made mistakes. Just help me." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, I deleted the email. Nick never recovered. He lost everything. His luxury lifestyle? Gone. His so-called career? Dead. He ended up filing for bankruptcy, drowning in debt, lawsuits, and broken relationships. He had burned too many bridges. Nobody wanted to help him. Even my parents, who had spent years enabling him, couldn't bail him out this time. Still, they tried to guilt me. My mother called, her voice shaking. "You destroyed your own brother," she sobbed. "He has nothing left." I let her words sit for a moment before responding, calm and unbothered. "No. He destroyed himself." And with that, I hung up. Nick disappeared after that. No one in the family heard from him for over a year. Last I checked, he was waiting tables at a dingy restaurant in some rundown part of town. My parents never spoke about him again, and honestly, I didn't care. Meanwhile, I was thriving. My business had grown tenfold, my grandfather's name was stronger than ever, and best of all, I never had to deal with my family again. Because at the end of the day, some people think family is forever. But I say, not when they try to destroy you.